one big important thing, there is no single Baptist denomination. There are different Baptist groups. There are conventions, like the Southern Baptist Convention, but because of the way Baptists are historically, denominations really can't exist, and I'll explain why as we go. So, if you think of Baptist as a denomination, a singular denomination for every single Baptist in the world, that would be accurate. But as far as individual denominations, that's really not the right way to think about it. I once heard it referred to as denominetworks, which I always thought was kind of silly, but it's not a bad definition. Maybe it sounds kind of silly, but it gives you a better concept of what we're talking about. The thing about being Baptist is what's done in one church will be different in another Baptist church down the street, same side of the street, next door neighbor. Doesn't matter. Individual churches decide what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. So that's why most folks don't know walking in here, this is a Baptist church, is because we do things our way. So
Each church is autonomous.
yes, which we will get to in a minute. But first we do need to talk about some history. This is very, very abbreviated. So this gentleman here is John Smith. Baptist started in Amsterdam, more or less. There's some argument about Anabaptist. That's not something we're going to talk about today. 1608, 1609, a group of English folks who had fled England for religious freedom gathered. They actually gathered in a bakehouse. I think the man's name, his first name was Jan. I don't remember his last name. Mutter? Right there. Oh, is it? Oh, it's right there. Munter. I was trying to go from memory. He was Mennonite himself, but he allowed them to meet there. And their leader, John Smith, baptized himself because they had come to believe that baptism of infants wasn't the right way to do things. And then he baptized everybody else. Well, that didn't last long. A little bit later, he said, I don't think that was the right thing to do. He repudiates his baptism. He wants all of his congregants to do the same, and a lot of them do. 31 members of the group do. They go on to join a Mennonite community. But then this gentleman, Thomas Helwys, that's how you say that, he says, no, I'm not doing that. I believe that we did the right thing. I do not believe that children should be baptized. This is what's good. He takes over the leadership of the remnant, more or less, and they excommunicate Smith and all of his followers. So from the very beginning, Baptists have a disagreement and we take our ball and go home. That's just long history of that. 1611, Helwys wrote that confession, a declaration of faith of the English people remaining at Amsterdam and Holland. And then in 1612, Helwys took his group, they went back to England, founded the first Baptist church on British soil. And that's all I have there, but he didn't have a great end. He got crosswise with the king, and he actually died in prison for his beliefs. Baptists in America. Early in 1639, a group came and settled in Providence, Rhode Island. This was their leader, Roger Williams, who hopefully some of you have heard of before. He, again, a lot like Smith, was the first to be baptized, but then later went, I don't know if that was the best thing to do, and he left. But the church was able to succeed without him, and from Rhode Island, and this is the Rhode Island Church, first Baptist church in the United States, Baptists spread around the country. So the other big thing for us to talk about, especially with Baptist history, that we do not talk about enough, is that Baptists in this country were instrumental in our country having a Bill of Rights, and specifically the First Amendment, which is right there. A lot of this was because Baptists were so poorly treated. In everywhere else except Rhode Island, they had to pay to help with the established church. Often that was the Church of England. In Massachusetts, they were likened to a cancer. And then in Virginia, they had to register their meeting houses, and even if they registered their meeting house, they had to financially support the Church of England. So, Baptists did not have an easy go of it.
until we got some leadership, especially a gentleman named John Leland, who was able, and you can see all those notes there, you can read those for yourself on the handout. John Leland's really important because he convinced James Madison, founding father James Madison, to support an amendment for religious liberty after the Constitution was ratified. So the Constitution went out to all the states. All of the states had to individually ratify the Constitution. So in Virginia, he was able to convince James Madison, put in this amendment for religious liberty once we get the Constitution ratified. And it worked. And then after the Constitution was ratified fully by the entire country, Madison introduced the Bill of Rights, the first of which guarantees the separation of church and state. And if you don't know, the First Amendment is here. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Goes on from there, talks about free speech. Very, very important. So, Baptists are instrumental in this. It's hard to know now, especially with the reputation I think a lot of Baptist folks have, but Baptists were instrumental in making sure there was a separation of church and state in our country. And we should be very, very proud of that, and we should talk about it a lot more often. I don't think we do a good job of it. Specifically in Louisiana, the first church, as far as we know, right, some of this we might not have records, was settled in the 1780s. This was still Spanish area, and obviously they were not Baptist. So religious leaders, preachers were often in trouble. But the first church established in Louisiana Territory was, you see the date there, October 12th, 1812, in Washington Parish. And I am not going to try to pronounce that river. Does someone know how to say that? Say it slower. Bogachita? Yep, glad I didn't try. It's Franklin, Louisiana now. And you can still go. This is still there. It's Half Moon Bluff Baptist Church. So if you're ever driving down that way and you want to stop, this was the first Baptist church settled in what is now the state of Louisiana. Okay, another big thing we got to talk about, because it specifically pertains to us, is the development of the Southern Baptist Convention. And again, 30,000 feet, right? So there's a lot of detail and nuance I don't have time to cover. These are the big pieces. Group of Southern Baptists, notice the small s, we're talking geographical Baptist at this point, not the convention. They were called together because there had been some movements, despite statements of neutrality, to not include slaveholders as missionaries. The American Baptist Home Mission Board refused to have a Georgia slaveholder be a missionary to the Cherokee people. They were supposed to be neutral, they still wouldn't let him do it. So this group of Southerners gathered and said, wait a minute, you said you were neutral, we're not going to stand for this, and decided to start their own convention. So that's where we see the first split between the Southern Baptist Convention, which we know, and specifically they were then Northern Baptist, but what we would call American Baptist today. This is where it starts. And Southern Baptists would argue that it was missions that was at the heart of this choice. But you can see this quote here, and this is from my Baptist Heritage textbook from seminary. The SBC was conceived in the womb of slavery. Whether or not it's talked about, you cannot separate the start of the Southern Baptist Convention from slavery, because they wanted slaveholders to be able to have the same rights as everybody else. I would argue that's a big mistake. They did not see it that way. So, whether or not they talk about it, Southern Baptist Convention came into being in large part because of slavery. And then we zoom forward in history to the 1970s, when these two gentlemen, specifically, it wasn't just them, but they were the big movers, orchestrated an effort for a fundamentalist takeover within the Southern Baptist Convention. The way that they did this was they managed to get their fundamentalist candidate elected president of the convention. And that person has a lot of power, a lot of influence. So that president can then nominate people for committees, for boards, suggest them to seminaries for presidential positions, which we'll see in a minute. And this guy on the top is Paige Patterson. If you've heard of him recently, he used to be the president. Thank you. I was thinking dean or president. I can't remember which one. And it was Southeast or what? Southwestern. Yeah, he got himself into quite a bit of trouble. Quite a few accusations of poor treatment of students and not reporting sexual abuse, and even that he might have participated in some of that. So he no longer serves in that position. I think, is Paul Pressler still alive? I don't know. Yeah, a lot of these guys did. He was not a minister, he was a layman. But they wanted to get liberalism out of the SBC. And you see there, they define that as the endorsement of the belief that the original text of the Bible can or does contain errors or mistakes. So it doesn't sound like a terrible thing, necessarily. Who doesn't want to have errors and mistakes removed from the Bible? But it was, in my view, it was some pretext to get into power and do what they wanted to do. So one of the big things this did was take over institutes of education, seminaries specifically. The biggest one was Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, crown jewel of the Southern Baptist Convention. There's a whole generation of folks older than me that everybody went to Southern. Yeah. Right. At least moderate, if not progressive. They had female students, they had female professors. Gender was not an issue. And then all of this happened, including, I think we're streaming. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. This little weasel. Paul Pressler's still alive? There you go. Yeah, Al Mohler was made president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And despite having, as a student, talked about the ordination of women and being in support of that, once he became president, that man saw the writing on the wall and came out against women in ministry. It's amazing what power and money can do for you. And this is a documentary called Battle for the Minds. It's old. It was made in the 90s, so the quality is not great. But it goes through some of these days at Southern as the takeover was happening and women were being pushed out. I highly recommend you watch it. It's free on YouTube. Billy Graham's daughter is interviewed for a couple of minutes at the beginning, and it will make you angry. It makes me cry every time I watch it. But it does a really good job of explaining how they went about specifically taking over at Southern. Because it went into the Board of Regents, and it was, one of the gentlemen says pretty early on, if you think women are called to be pastors, that's just not right, and that's not going to happen here. So you need to go somewhere else. And that is still their stance to this day. They actually, there is a program for pastors' wives. They have a Pastors' Wives Institute that was started by Dr. Mohler's wife for the wives of ministers. And some of the professors, all male now, will go in and teach the ladies. I tried to look up the curriculum. It's not on the website because I wanted to know what is the base of the curriculum, what are the classes they take, because it is a program that they're going through. They don't list it. Yeah, I'm sure that they would love it. You know, how do you keep your household? Right. How do you keep your household going while and support your husband's ministry? Yeah, it's interesting. And it's all of like the professors' wives come in and help teach these classes. They've got videos. You should look them up. The point here is that 3 Southern seminaries, they lost 90% of their faculty in a 5 to 10 year period. That is an enormous amount of turnover. And when you see that it was replaced by men. There were no women left. One of the women highlighted in Battle for the Minds is a former professor of mine. Her name is Dr. Molly Marshall. And she went on to become a seminary president. She's retired now. But they drove her out. They got rid of her. They drove her out. So this continued. In 1984, this turned into the SBC adopting a resolution encouraging churches not to ordain women to the ministry. And because of that, Southern Baptist agencies felt that they could refuse to appoint women as missionaries, right? You're not going to ordain them. We don't have to let them be missionaries. And at SBC seminaries, they began adopting policies that even if you were a female student, you could not take preaching and pastoral leadership classes, which is pretty foundational if you want to go into ministry, take a few preaching classes at least. And then finally, they doubled down in 2000 and came out with the Baptist Faith and Message, which is kind of their big doctrinal statement they put out every few years. And part of what it said was this: while both men and women are gifted for service in the church, the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. So, not a lot of argument left there. Made it pretty clear where they're standing. And this continues to be their stance. And this is when those who hadn't already left. So the response was, and this is again, specifically pertains to us, those who opposed fundamentalism, supported women in ministry, etc., broke away, left, hearts broken, to form their own organizations, schools, missional outreach approaches. And the two big ones, there are several, but the two big ones are the Alliance, which we are still part of, and the CBF, which is the group I grew up in. And the seminary I went to is the CBF seminary. The Alliance started in 1986, was at first the Southern Baptist Alliance. They moved away from that name. And the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship was officially formed in 1991. So these are still pretty young organizations. To this day, the Alliance, hopefully you all know this, is who we are a part of. Relatively small. It's growing some, but it's still a relatively small organization, mostly in the South. CBF is a little bit bigger. Alliance is really not big enough to have their own seminaries, and that's not something that, to my knowledge, has ever been pursued. CBF does. They have, 6 or 8 seminaries. One of them is closed. I don't know the exact numbers anymore.
Actually, the Alliance started the seminary in Richmond.
Oh, did they? I didn't know that.
But, the Alliance was too small to support.
Right.
So really an independent seminary, but it couldn't make it. And CBF picked up some of
Yeah.
of the load supporting them.
Yeah, they're CBF now, aren't they? Oh, that's right. That's right. Thank you. They did close.
Cooperative Baptist Fellowship differ from Alliance of Baptists in terms of whatever beliefs or...
Yeah, I would say they're more moderate. My frustration is they're moderate to the point of fence sitting, especially over LGBTQ issues. They have a bigger organizational structure. The Alliance is pretty streamlined, and the Alliance doesn't have a home office. CBF has a home office in Atlanta. It's on the campus where I went to grad school. CBF is just larger. I would say probably has more financial resources because of its size. I think in some ways it's more attractive to folks who are still also SBC, because I know quite a few churches that are aligned with both. And let's make this really clear. To be aligned with a Baptist organization, the down and dirty of that is you give them money. It's that simple. We are an alliance church for many reasons. The most basic one is that's where we give our money. We support missions through them. We help support the work that they're doing. We get things back, but that's what it means to be part of these organizations. So that's not really a very nice answer, but so you understand, that's how you join one of these organizations, is you decide you're going to support them financially, okay? Because we don't have to be a part of anything. What is the other big difference with CBF? They have a executive director, they have all this staff, they have field personnel, so their approach to missions is really different. They're still more or less sending missionaries. The Alliance, I think, does a better job of working with pre-existing organizations in certain countries, like our partnership with Cuba. It's a different approach to missions. The CBF is going through it right now over LGBTQ issues. So we need to talk specifically about what makes Baptist Baptist. And there are 4 things: Bible freedom, soul freedom, church freedom, religious freedom. These are called the 4 fragile freedoms. You can read all of this to yourself. It's on the handout if you want to. The first one, Bible freedom, and this is from Walter B. Sheridan. He's kind of the godfather of these sorts of things, and his book is very short if you want to read it. It's Bible freedom is the affirmation that the Bible, under the lordship of Christ, must be central to the life of the individual, and that church and that Christians with the best and most scholarly tools of inquiry are both free and obligated to study and obey the Scripture. Sorry, there's a typo in there. What this means more or less is that we all have the right and ability and the responsibility to read the Bible and interpret it for ourselves. And that as a church, we get to decide, along with the leadership of Christ, how we're going to interpret that Scripture. And that the Bible should be central. Okay? Soul freedom. Affirmation in the inalienable right and responsibility of every person to deal with God without the imposition of creed, the interference of clergy, or the intervention of civil government. So, I've talked about Baptists being non-creedal people. This is where that comes into play. Baptist churches do not use creeds. That's one of maybe the only things you can say about Baptist churches. We don't use creeds. So those of us who grew up Baptist, I don't know. I don't have the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed memorized. Do y'all? Yes. Everybody else probably does because you did it in church. If you grew up Baptist, you don't. I didn't really even know much about those till I went to seminary. Certainly didn't know the history. It just was never part of my religious practice. What you're going to see here is also interference of clergy. What that means is y'all don't need a minister or a pastor for you to reach out to God. And intervention of civil government. That gets back to that separation of church and state we talked about before. The next piece is church freedom. Affirmation that local churches are free under the lordship of Christ to determine their membership and leadership, to order that their worship and work, to ordain whom they perceive as gifted for ministry, male or female, and to participate in the larger body of Christ of those whose unity and mission Baptists are proudly a part. So this is that every Baptist church is autonomous, is basically what this is. Meaning we don't have to answer to a governing body. We don't answer to a district coordinator, manager, any of those sorts of things. We make our decisions for ourselves. That can be really wonderful, because if we decide we want to do something, we just do it. It can also be really hurtful if there's church split, because you don't have anybody else to rely on. It's just you. So this is autonomy of the local church, more or less. And then the last one is religious freedom, and I want y'all to notice what I have underlined. This is the affirmation of freedom of religion, for religion, and from religion. The insistence being that Caesar is not Christ and Christ is not Caesar, right? Going back to the text, back to the words of Jesus. Freedom of religion, for religion, from religion. So Baptists are going to defend people's right to go to church, not go to church, do church however they want, make those choices for themselves. And that's foundational to who we are. And that goes back to John Smith, Roger Williams, all those guys we talked about before. So I would like for you to guess, please, how many Baptist groups are there? And we're talking globally. Probably tens of thousands. So here's what I'm going to show you. And this is Wikipedia, okay? So take that for what it is. I was going to type all this out and then decided there's not enough love in the world for that. So let me make this larger. And this is just a very quick list. So this is Africa, this first section. You see all those different churches. Then we have Asia and Oceania. These are all India here. This is the Caribbean. And this doesn't even have the groups that we know of. They're not listed. So they're, because it's Baptist Convention of Eastern Cuba and Baptist Convention of Western Cuba. So they don't have the, there are at least, what, two more? Right. So that's why I'm saying take this list with a grain of salt, because we know for sure they're missing at least two in Cuba. We could, because it's Wikipedia. Here is Europe and Eurasia. It's a little fuzzy. There we go, that's better. Some. Okay, that's all Europe. Here's North America. Well, that's not going to get better. Okay, you see the United States. That's all the United States. And there's the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And let's see. The Alliance is right there. So they at least have those two listed. So, oh, doesn't want to work. Okay, so that's all the United States. And these are state and interstate bodies, so that's a whole different section. Then we have Central and South America, and then what they're terming other, okay? All of those. And we know for a fact they're missing some. So I wanted you to see that so you get an idea of what we're talking about here when I say there's no single Baptist denomination. There's no one-way Baptists do things. This is why. And those are just the organized groups. Then you have folks who are not going to join a group who do their own thing. They wouldn't be on this list, right? So, with all that in mind, we've got 9 minutes before we need to clear out. What questions, what thoughts, what comments do you have? Yeah.
What would you say, other than merging, do we all have in common? If we're all that different, what do we have in common?
Lord's Prayer, or the Lord's Supper. Those are the two ordinances in Baptist life, not sacrament. Not sacrament, I couldn't think of the word. Ordinances, which I think is awful. I prefer the word sacrament. Those are pretty foundational. Baptism, communion, Lord's Supper, whatever you want to call it. Other than that,
Those other four fragile freedoms
yeah,
should be, but
they
to many
often aren't.
Baptists, they're not.
Right, right. I would say, honestly, the thing that defines Baptists the most is independence, individualism, some of which is beautiful, and just sheer stubborn, you're not going to tell me what to do. We're going to do our own thing. I think that is pretty consistent throughout.
When we formed Northminster, there were a lot of our friends, particularly the Episcopal Methodist tradition, who said, how in the world can you form your own church?
Right.
And we
That's it. That's it exactly, right there.
But, I mean, in, like, I know for sure in the Methodist tradition, and of course, Catholic, the congregation technically doesn't have any control over who is assigned as their
Right.
pastor. It's done by the bishop
Right.
for the diocese or whatever it's called, the Methodist world.
Correct.
You have some say. If you
Yeah.
don't want someone, you can sure let them know and they'll.
But you don't individually call that person, right? In the Methodist Church? Right.
There are people within each church that have influence.
Right.
And yet
Right.
determine whether someone comes. But you don't go out and ask.
Yeah, you certainly get a say, but you're also not forming a search committee. Right. Although Presbyterians do that. Yeah, Bob.
As a newcomer to this group, I'm sort of constantly asking myself what makes this congregation Baptist, because you all are sort of secret Baptists. My first exposure to Northminster was through online services during the pandemic, and I thought this was a non-denominational church at first, because there was no reference to Baptist made, there's nothing in the name, there was no reference made in the service or anything like that. And so it was really a few weeks before I realized that this church identified itself as a Baptist church. And I know, I've read Dr. Gaddy's book about how the church started, and the decision about not putting Baptist in the name of the church. Not sure I fully understand that, but I still continue to ask myself what makes Northminster Baptist, other than an occasional reference to its connection with the Alliance of Baptists. If you come to the service, it's not a Baptist traditional service. The church doesn't look like a Baptist church. And so I guess those are just kind of ongoing questions for me. I'm very attracted to the church.
Yeah.
And I like the way it is, but if I were to go to First West or to Parkview or to North Monroe and ask them what makes you a Baptist church, I think they get a very different answer
They absolutely would.
than here.
And I would not either, which is the biggest thing. Part of it is, we don't use creeds, and we won't in our worship services. We govern ourselves, which is not as